You may have heard about the Amateur Radio Parity Act, and we wanted to take some time to dispel some myths about the legislation. But first, let's start by telling you a little bit about what amateur radio is. Amateur radio is two-way communication that allows operators, or hams, to send voice and data over radio waves. Because amateur radio requires virtually no infrastructure, it keeps working after your computer, cell phone, and television stop working. In emergencies, amateur radio is an invaluable national asset. But don't take our word for it. Listen to Craig Fugate, the head of FEMA.
As much as we think we're sophisticated with technology, things break. Seeing how amateur radio, in a disaster, in a crisis, was oftentimes the one thing that was still up and running.
ARRL signed an updated Memorandum of Understanding with FEMA just last year to assist in national crises. ARRL has similar agreements with the Salvation Army and the American Red Cross. Amateur radio operators are available and prepared to assist in a disaster. And this army of federally licensed ham radio operators provide these services for free. That's good for the taxpayer, and that's good for America. So what does the Amateur Radio Parity Act do? While amateur radio doesn't need much infrastructure, it does require some sort of outdoor antenna. And increasingly, deed-restricted communities across the country use cookie-cutter prohibitions of any outdoor radio antennas. There's no problem if you live where zoning is under the jurisdiction of municipal zoning laws. Since 1985, when Ronald Reagan's FCC created a three-part test that prevents local governments from outright bans of amateur radio antennas, local governments have to give some reasonable accommodation to amateur radio. The local government can still regulate what best fits their community. This has worked beautifully for over 30 years. But if an amateur radio operator lives in a deed-restricted community, chances are they have no access to any antenna of any size because they are banned outright, even when the antenna is nothing more than a piece of wire that is impossible to see. And the number of deed-restricted communities has exploded since the 1980s. Today it is virtually impossible to buy a home that was built after 1985 that isn't subject to an HOA. And that is why the Amateur Radio Parity Act is necessary. It takes the time-tested 30-year-old reasonable accommodation standard and applies it to deed-restricted communities. Unfortunately, there is a smear campaign against this legislation, and we need to respond to these blatant lies. This bill will not lead to giant radio towers in every backyard in America. Each neighborhood is different, so each HOA will regulate what best fits their community. Because what works for suburban Los Angeles won't necessarily work in rural Kansas, so a one-size-fits-all approach just won't work. The Amateur Radio Parity Act doesn't take away any jurisdiction from HOAs or impact or negate HOA agreements. HOAs, not the hams, will decide on height and placement of radio antennas. The Amateur Radio Parity Act is not heavy-handed. The 1996 Telecommunications Act removed the ability for communities to regulate over-the-air television broadcast antennas and satellite dishes. Homeowners can install satellite dishes or TV antennas, and there is nothing HOAs can do to stop them. Our bill does nothing like this. Amateur radio operators in these communities just want a seat at the table to negotiate a reasonable accommodation from HOAs. But HOAs don't want there to even be a table, and instead just continue to give a blanket no. The ARRL thinks there is plenty of common ground to be found between HOAs and amateur radio operators to make sure that all of our communities are prepared when disaster strikes.
When Katrina knocked out communication services on the coast, amateur radio operators provided many people their only contact to the outside world. Today, Senator Roger Wicker thanked the operators who played a critical role during the disaster.
It's a good opportunity for us to thank the amateur radio operators for their role in helping the public and helping to save lives.
Senator Wicker is co-sponsoring the Amateur Radio Parity Act. It would urge the FCC to ease restrictions so more people can set up amateur radio stations in communities that ban them.
What we don't want is just a blanket prohibition of amateur radios.
And these blanket prohibitions prevent hams from practicing their craft and being ready to provide communications assistance in an emergency.
And you got to be prepared. And amateur radio is always that last mile system. When everything else fails, a ham transmitting can mean the difference between life and death.
We hope this provides some level of clarity on amateur radio parity, and we hope that you will support the Amateur Radio Parity Act, because opposing reasonable accommodation is just unreasonable. Learn more at arrl.org and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.